We're good to
All
go.
right. Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks all of you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm particularly pleased to be chatting with you today about the leader's role in mental health. I think it is such an incredibly important topic. It's a topic that was gaining momentum even prior to the pandemic. And I think it goes without saying that certainly the additional stress and strain of an unprecedented event, coupled with increasing pressures, whether that's digital disruption or certainly, political unrest, increased violence, we really are, in many ways, our mental health is very much, at a breaking point for so many of us. And so that trend that started before the pandemic, I think has just accelerated. And I think it's a focus that is so critical for leaders and their people if they want to continue to be not only productive, but also satisfied by the work that they do, show up in a way that makes them proud as employees and as human beings. So mental health is an important topic, and I'm pleased to be covering today specifically the leader's role in mental wellness and well-being. I am Leah Clark, a researcher, speaker, and coach, and I have the good fortune of being able to chat with groups like you about key trends that are facing our leaders, our workplaces, and offer some suggestions for how leaders can continue to show up for their people in ways that help them to be better employees, but also better human beings. And this topic so much connects to that particular goal, to really care for our people, not only for the contributions they make, but for the individuals that they are. This is part of a three-part webinar series. About 2 weeks ago, I talked about the great recalibration, which is really how folks are reflecting on the role of their values, their job conditions in their lives, and making an adjustment in some way. Sometimes that's resignation, but sometimes it's a modification to their hours, the way that they get their work done. And I talked about the role of mental well-being as part of that recalibration, how people are paying attention to this in ways that we've never seen before and being much more vocal about it. And it was such an important topic that I didn't want to leave it as a single bullet point in the last webinar. And so this is really intended as time for us to explore how the leader can play a meaningful role in the conversation around mental wellness, how they can be all in. In another 2 weeks, we'll talk about stability and agility in leadership. I hope you'll join us for that session. And as is the case with the prior webinar and the one in 2 weeks and today, my goal really is to, again, elevate these trends and talk about their impact on your role as a leader, the impact on your workforce, and provide some education around the mindsets and skill sets that leaders need for practical support. So before we get too far into the discussion, what I'd love to know from those of you on the phone, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat and the poll, is how comfortable are you talking about issues of mental health with your coworkers? Where is your comfort level right now? I know Steve is going to pop up the poll in the chat, and Steve, I should be able to see that in the chat, correct? Oh, okay. Other folks should be able to see it as well. Let's take a look here. All right, we'll give everybody just a couple of seconds. I know we have a really long time limit here. We will not be going the full 5 minutes or so to see the results. And Steve, I'll wait for you to let me know when you think we have a good number who have responded. And I see that we have more folks joining as we go through. So if you're just joining, I've popped up a poll question, which is how comfortable are you talking about issues of mental well-being with your coworkers? Looking for some responses in the chat. And as we go through the poll, and Steve, I want to make sure folks can still see my screen as we also see the results. Is that possible?
At the current moment, no. We're just seeing your video. As
That's
soon as we
fine.
close the poll, then you'll be able to go back to your screen.
Wonderful. So why don't we go ahead and do that?
Okay.
and take a look here. I know we've got a small group, but this is also a question I didn't want to put in the chat for some of the reasons that I'll talk about in just a minute. It looks like, about 12% of you are very comfortable, 37% somewhat, and then another 12% not at all. So you can see my screen now, yeah? Just checking on that one, Steve. Can folks see my
Yep.
screen now?
You should.
All right,
You'll have to
fantastic.
click the share. Yep.
Okay, great. Want to
You're a
make
presenter now.
sure. There we go. Okay, awesome. So, the reason I wanted to ask you that question is because I do feel as though there is a bit of a misperception on the part of leaders around the discussion of mental health. There's a discomfort, if you will, about engaging in discussions around mental health and mental well-being. And I think there are a few reasons for that. First of all, some folks feel as though, well, mental health is a concern for a subset of the population. That doesn't apply to everyone. But the truth is, if you are a living, breathing human being, then just like physical health applies to you, so too does mental health. So it's something that we all have and something that we all need to maintain on a regular basis. Second of all, and I think the poll gets at this a little bit, and we'll talk about this in the time that we have together, there's still a bit of a stigma associated with issues of mental health. Well, gosh, that's not something that we bring into the workplace. That's part of your home life. But when we look at how our home lives and our work lives have collided more than ever, it's time to recognize, as I said in our last webinar, that we don't have an emotional moat around us, that we bring our feelings and our thoughts into not only our home life, those relationships, but we bring it into our work life and the relationships that we have with our colleagues. So if you're thinking that it's for a subset of the population, that is quite honestly not true. We all have mental health. That stigma associated with it, I think we need to start addressing that, and I hope to do that today. And then last but not least, what I'll say is if you're a leader who has kept that conversation at arm's length, now is the time to begin to embrace the discussion, because if you don't bring it up, your people will. And if you don't bring it up, your people may make decisions to recalibrate or resign as a result of trying to take care of their own mental wellness. So the time is here for leaders to, what I would say is, open up the conversation. And another thing that you may be thinking or feeling, or you may hear from your leaders is, I don't have the time to worry about this. I have other responsibilities that I need to be mindful of. I have contributions that I need to make to the organization. My people need to be productive. And so this is not a conversation that I'm going to engage in. And more importantly, I'm not a therapist. I can't be a therapist for my people. Well, I want to say to both of those concerns that no one is asking you as a leader. I'm certainly not suggesting as a leader that you should, as a leader, take on the role of therapist. That's not what this is about. I do think that being in therapy and having a coach are certainly actions that people can take and seek sources of support beyond what you can provide as a leader. So the role of the leader is not to become that for your people, but it is to start opening up the conversation. Begin embracing the role that mental wellness plays in your organization and with your people. And this is maybe the most important thing that I'd love for you to start considering. How can I destigmatize the conversation of mental wellness at work and with my people? So not asking you to jump in and be a therapist for your people or diagnose mental illness, just saying it's time to open up the conversation and recognize the role that mental wellness plays in our organization. So with that as a backdrop, what are we going to cover today? Well, I'd like to first define the difference between mental health and mental illness, perhaps to give you a little bit of that relief that you need to be, a clinician, because that's not what we're talking about. Then I'd like to share some information about why mental health matters in leadership and at work. And then last but not least, as I thought about the key message that I wanted leaders to take away, it's that it's time for you to be all in on mental well-being, not to dabble with a, summer Friday kind of thing every once in a while, but to really say, how can I as a leader be aware, listen, learn, educate myself, inquire, and above all, be non-judgmental. So that's what we will unpack in the time that we have for the rest of this session. So first, let's talk a little bit about what's the difference, just to level set on the terminology. So when we're talking about mental illness, that refers to a diagnosable mental disorder. It's individuals who have significant challenges, more prolonged challenges in thinking, emotion, or behavior, and it can cause distress. It can cause problems functioning in social situations, work, or family activities. That's not what I want to talk about today. That is certainly an area for further discussion, but again, not within the context of what we're asking leaders to do. What I am suggesting is that leaders should consider what they can do to contribute and support the mental health of their people. When we have, whoops, fast mouse there. When we have good mental health, we are able to recognize that we have abilities, that what we're capable of performing at work and in life. We can cope with the stresses that we need to confront and continue to be productive and have fruitful relationships. Now, what I want to also be really clear about is folks who have mental illness can experience periods of mental health, just like those who are mentally healthy may sometimes have episodes of mental illness. But a lot of times these terms are confused and conflated. And what I want us to focus on today is that right-hand side of things. Not asking leaders to diagnose, but asking leaders to think about and open up the conversation around how they can support their people in recognizing their own abilities, coping with the regular stresses, and being productive and living a fruitful existence at work and at home. And why is this such a critical issue now? There is not a single article that you can read about the trends of 2022 or what leaders need to be concerned about without finding in that first bullet, second or third bullet, the mention of mental wellness. So I think it is certainly been elevated, and it's been elevated for many of the large reasons that we know about and that maybe we see reflected in the headlines. COVID has ratcheted up the physical anxiety that we have, the concerns that we have over our loved ones, and that is a big boulder, that is significant. There is an always on anxiety that I think a lot of folks feel as parents, as employees. I can give you an example in my own life, and I think a lot of parents can relate to this. Once upon a time, although I worried about my children, once they were in school, I could maybe shut that anxiety off and focus on my job. Now it's a little bit harder. Maybe they're in virtual school, and so that separation isn't there. Or maybe I'm now worried about, did Colin's mask slip down? Is there really going to be some sort of a violence in the school as there was fear of back in December? So that idea of, my children are now safe and I can focus on my job, it's been disintegrating a little bit, and we have this always on anxiety. It's also happening, I think, because of that breakdown, as one author said, of that ecosystem between work and home. And now we are always checking our email, maybe, tethered to our phone more beyond the normal work hours because that separation has broken down. Leaders now need to deal with additional anxieties as folks are, as folks are dealing with return to the office. Now there is certainly concern and anxiety about that. I'm going back into the office. How do I feel about that? I didn't have to commute before. And now, I'm worried about what that will look like and feel like. So the large boulders are there. The shifting priorities and concerns of people is significant. And then what I would say is we've always had those smaller pebbles that impact our emotional well-being. Maybe a difficult conversation that we had with a sibling or an interaction with a colleague. The bottom line is this concept of having emotions and mental health is a meaningful one. And we are increasingly, I think, a bit under siege and needing to recognize that there are things that we can do as organizations and as leaders to deal with these issues. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here. And yeah, it seems as though, Steve, you said there are some people waiting to ask questions. So I'd love to stop now rather than press through and see what is coming up for people. What questions do you have? And see if we can chat and answer some of those right out of the gate. So Steve, I think, should I be able to see those if I click on chat or?
They didn't ask them directly in the chat, but everyone is able to unmute themselves, so you can go ahead and come off mute, and you would be able to go and ask your questions.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, they did put it in the chat as well.
Okay. Is there a distinction between mental health and well-being? Yeah, I mean, what I would say is sometimes well-being is used more broadly to include financial well-being, spiritual well-being, mental well-being. So I may be, Stace, myself conflating those terms, but mental health is a little bit more confined. And based on the research that I've done, that term of well-being may apply more broadly to other aspects of your life. So for those of you who know the wheel of life, I would consider that maybe a broader look at your overall well-being, and mental health typically, as the name implies, refers to sort of your thoughts and your emotions and how you're doing with respect to, again, recognizing your own abilities and coping with the appropriate stresses. Thanks, Stace. And please, if it goes without saying, though, I sometimes get carried away as I start with these conversations. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Please feel free to raise your hand. And if you have a point to share on the topic, go ahead and include that as well. Okay, so let's segue into, well, why should I care as a leader? Maybe you're only marginally convinced that this is something that you need to be concerned with. Well, the bottom line is there are many reasons why you should care about the mental health of your people. Certainly, it impacts productivity and it impacts turnover. The American Psychiatric Association said that employees with unresolved depression experience a 35% reduction in productivity, and that equates to $210 billion loss each year for organizations. So it is certainly significant. It impacts turnover. This data was from an organization called Limeade, and it was also republished on hrexecutive.com. 40% of employees who left their job for a different one did so because of burnout, 40%. And another 28% who left their jobs without another one, they were twice as likely to cite burnout as the reason why they were leaving. So the numbers are absolutely there to indicate, as they have for quite some time, that productivity, absenteeism, turnover are all impacted when folks feel as though their mental wellness is at risk. And then what I would like to hope is that it's not just about the numbers, right? It's not just about the productivity and the turnover, but that we are increasingly, as leaders, taking a people before profits mentality that hopefully if we've come through this pandemic with some sort of shared humanity, it's around these concepts that we value people over profits, and we recognize how interconnected we all are. So productivity, turnover, absenteeism, absolutely, and people before profits. Okay, so let's dig in and talk about, if the leader's role is certainly to stay in that place of being mindful of how they can support mental wellness, what specifically can they do? I'd love to hear from you first. And I apologize, my mouse is a little sensitive here, but I'd love to hear from you in the chat. If you were to say, what do you think right now, or maybe coming into this webinar, the role of the leader is in mental wellness and mental well-being? If you could put one word or phrase in the chat. And maybe that is stay out of it. Maybe that is something else, but honest answers only, please. If you could put one word or phrase in the chat that is what you think the role of the leader is in mental well-being. Not a stressor, okay. See the real person. Stace, thanks for that. Absolutely. Support. Yep, support. Yep. They need to be aware of, but they aren't inherently responsible. Absolutely, Lydia. Absolutely. I think that word support is the right way to think about it. And I'm focusing very specifically on the leader in this webinar because I think that there have been actions that have been taken at the corporate level, and we'll talk about those at the end. Certain programs and benefits that large scale organizations are putting in place to address this issue. And I don't think that that's enough. I think that that leader is often where the rubber meets the road. They're the ones that interact with people on a daily basis. And so that support and being able to see the real person, as Stace puts it, I think happens at that very specific level. So let's talk about what the role of the leader is and is not. And some of this I touched upon. So quite simply, it is not to be a therapist. It is not to diagnose mental illness, and it's not to be invasive. We'll talk about this. This is a very fine line, I think, for leaders to walk as their people maybe open up with them about their own mental health struggles. It's going to be a very thoughtful and intentional conversation that leaders need to navigate, but it's not to be a therapist, not to diagnose, and not to be invasive. I think it is, first of all, to acknowledge that wellness is important, to engage in conversation, very thoughtful conversation, informed conversation, and sometimes sensitive conversation. And then, as you all said, it is to provide support where possible. For me, again, as I said at the beginning, I really feel like it's time for leaders to acknowledge that this is a relevant part of who your people are and address it through that support. So if we can destigmatize the conversation, talk about why it's relevant, and open minds and create dialogue, then I think we will see the results not only in the numbers, but also in the way our people feel cared for. So the message here that I came up with to help this stick for leaders is that they be all in on this discussion. And what does that mean? First of all, awareness. We'll talk about what that looks like at the larger level, the team level, and also for the leader at the personal level. So aware. And then listen in some very different ways than you might listen if you were talking about your to-do list or the contributions that you want your people to make. Learn. The comment of, my Google works the same way that yours does, whether it's this webinar or the many, many articles and discussions that are out there. Learn more about what this topic means and how you can show up as a way of support for your people. And then inquire, again, thoughtfully and in some maybe more gentle ways than you might typically be used to, and then non-judgmental. So aware, listen, learn, inquire, and then non-judgmental. So I'll unpack each of those as we dig a little bit further into the discussion. But what I'd like to know as we talk about that first that awareness, what are some of the signs that you've seen with your colleagues or your teams that signal they are under stress? And I want to distinguish, as you put your answer in the chat, that stress is not the same thing as mental wellness. You may have periods of stress and your mental wellness may not be compromised. Maybe you're heading into a big webinar or a big meeting and there is a spike in your stress level, but a prolonged level of stress and anxiety that impacts the way that you're able to cope and show up, then you're starting to veer into another direction. But what are some of the signs that you've seen with your colleagues or your teams that maybe signal that they are at the very least under stress? What might you notice that would indicate that stress is an issue? So change in habits, arrival times, lunch routine. Yep. They're quieter or louder than usual, apathetic or volatile. Yeah, really charged words, Lydia, but accurate. Irritable for sure. Short in their responses. Yeah, absolutely. And so, you're tuning into some of the things that are fairly intuitive and logical. And the first step that I'm suggesting here is that we be aware of others. What is it that you notice? What is it that you see? Are they showing up late to meetings repeatedly? Are they asking for questions to be repeated, maybe a sign that they are tuned out or not able to track the conversation? Are they repeatedly missing deadlines? Are you aware of what's going on for them, bigger picture? Again, and I've talked about this in other webinars, what is their lived reality? Are they caring for an elderly parent? Do they have a child who's being, virtual schooled? What is it that you hear in what they share? What you know is the backdrop of their home life. And then what do you see? What do you notice in their behaviors? What I would also say is there are things that we don't see. And there is a metaphor that I think is helpful, which is to know that each person shows up with what some call an invisible suitcase. And that invisible suitcase includes our traumas, our values, the stuff that's going on that people don't know about, but you lug around with you for better or worse. And so whether you say to yourself, everybody's got stuff going on, and I don't always say it that way, but everybody's got stuff going on, or you think about the fact that people have an invisible suitcase, just starting as a leader with that awareness that people are bringing something with them to every situation, home life and work life, that's a good place to start in interacting with your people and in showing them some of the grace that they may need during what might be particularly challenging times. And then self-awareness. So awareness of others, awareness of the larger context, and then self-awareness. How are you feeling? Are you maybe in a place where your own mental well-being is compromised? Are you taking care of yourself, doing what we know makes sense in terms of eating well, getting rest, being aware of creating more of a separation between work and home if that collapse is what's causing you additional, compromised well-being. So self-awareness as a leader, self-awareness as well around, are you saying one thing to your people and then modeling something else? If you talk about no meeting Fridays and then schedule meetings, or talk about summer Fridays where folks are able to take time off and be with their families, but then it's clear that you're online that entire time, you're going to start to create a mixed message for your people. Mental wellness is important, but I'm still going to continue to work even during the times that we've talked as a team about carving out for well-being. So awareness, not only for others, but also self-awareness. Number two, listen. This again is about really your ability to amplify your listening and listening actively. What is it that you hear in the words that they're saying, but also what is not being said? What is the tone that they are and tenor they are bringing to the conversation? Do you sense that they're trying to share something that may be a little bit difficult for them because it might be about an accommodation they need or a challenge that they're having at home? Can you sit with that conversation in a very centered and focused way, listen actively, reflect not only what you hear, but the emotion as well? And when you're listening, particularly around issues that have to do with wellness and well-being, if your folks are willing to share maybe some of the challenges that they're experiencing, it's not the time to solve or compare. Not to say, oh, well, my son went through this and I had a relative who, and when I have a hard time doing this, here's how. When you're listening with, in a way that's attuned to mental wellness, and your people are bringing challenges that they have, it's not about solving or comparing, but about listening in a very empathetic way. And so, I apologize. I did source this, but I may have grabbed the image without the source. I'll provide all of my sources at the end of the discussion. But I thought that this was just a great visual that hammered home this point, right? So you don't want to be on the right-hand side. Don't be upset. It could be worse. The same thing happened to me. It's really about saying things like, how did that make you feel? Or that sounds heavy. Or maybe just, I'm here, and then sitting sometimes with that emotion with them and that silence. And I promised you that I'm not suggesting that leaders become therapists. And with what I said right now, I can feel that it might seem a little bit like I'm suggesting that to you. I'm not. I'm just saying that there are times where, again, sitting with that emotion instead of solving and just holding the space for them to talk about what's going on is enough, is absolutely enough. So again, listening to others, amplify your ability to listen actively, don't solve or compare, empathize with them, and sometimes just giving space is enough. You don't have to fill in the silences. Something that you can probably tell since you're on my webinars is something I like to do, but we have to work at this as leaders, and we need to show up in a way that expresses that empathy and indicates that we value people for the person they are. Okay, so then when you are educating or when you're learning, educate yourself. Again, your Google works the same as mine. There is no scarcity of information on this topic that talks about the benefits of learning about how you can show up for your leaders, why, or your people, why this is such a critical issue. Start to understand what mental health looks like on a continuum, and I'll show you what that continuum looks like in just a moment. But learn about what the signals are. The person's performance is off. I see that. As a leader, I think that's often the first place we go, right? Because that feels a little bit safer, that's tangible, they're missing deadlines, but also recognize if they're expressing it to you. I think you'd be fortunate if they're openly saying, I'm fatigued, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, because that gives you an opening to the conversation. But what about if they're not expressing it, but they seem quick to irritability? And again, this isn't a singular moment where they're stressed or a week where maybe they're having a tough time. When you start to see that over a more prolonged period of time, they're not able to show up for the organization, for their team members, or for themselves the way that you need them to and want them to, that's when you're starting to become aware of the fact that maybe there is something more than what I might call the day-to-day stresses and anxieties of life. So here's another great resource that you can look at and consider when you say, okay, well, Leah's telling me to be aware. What am I aware of? It is that mental health does exist on a spectrum. And you might see, even when there is strong mental health, normal mood fluctuations, as I mentioned. People are still performing well. They continue to seem as though they are in control of their emotions and they are mentally well. Well, what might be a sign that they're veering into a place that suggests they need me to open up this conversation, they need more support? You see irritability, you see nervousness. Again, maybe they're forgetful. And you may not see all of this information, but sometimes they'll share it with you. I know I've been in situations where I'll talk about the number of Tylenol or Advil I've taken in a day, right? And so I'm starting to send that message that, yeah, something's off with me physically. And so, without belaboring the point, the key message here is that if you're going to be aware and listen and learn as a leader, here are some of the things that you can learn about and some of the things that you can look for that helps you recognize folks are maybe veering into a place that is not healthy. So last but not last but not least, second to last, is inquire. So ask questions to understand. Keep that communication open. Ask them what's going on. If you notice that there is something that they're either expressing or exhibiting that indicates they're falling into a place where they might need broader support. Because when you talk to them about this, there are things that you might be able to control, you might be able to help them with. If they need to accommodate something at home with their child, perhaps you can adjust their schedule. If they feel comfortable enough sharing with you that they need further support in the form of therapy, maybe there is a 9 o'clock Thursday morning that you recognize is time that they're going to be giving to addressing that for themselves. Can you help dial down the digital element that may be causing additional stress and strain? None of this is about telling your people that you don't expect them to show up for their team members or the organization. But as we've seen in the numbers, and as I think we all probably know intuitively, if you're able to give people the space to address their mental wellness, just as you would have them address their physical wellness, they can show up for you in ways that will be, their performance will be more significant, their contributions will be more significant in the end than if you confine your relationship with them to just what they can do from a contribution standpoint. I do think that, as I said at the beginning, when you start to begin to have more conversations around mental wellness, you have to avoid prying. And I don't think that there is a secret decoder ring on this. As a leader, you're going to need to be intuitive. You're going to have to use those skills of emotional intelligence and read the cues and the signs from your people in terms of how much they are willing to share. I think the more trust you have with your people, the more that you can open this conversation up more broadly. Trust is an essential element to any good leadership relationship. And the more that folks trust you, the more they're typical willing to share about not only what struggles they have, but where you can support them. And I think Stace just put a phenomenal question in the chat. Thank you for grounding me back to some helpful tips. That question that you put here that is open-ended and very sensitive and kind, opening the door for an individual to share really anything, right? And what I love about that question, Stace, is it could be about contribution. It could be something tactical that the leader could do, but it might also be something bigger that they haven't been able to find that opening to share with you as a leader. And so just a beautiful illustration of, is there anything else you'd like me to know? A way to open that conversation without prying. So thanks for that, Stace. The truth is, as we head into the very last part of All In, which is non-judgmental, there are still misperceptions and biases around the concept of mental health. And the reason why I highlighted this one is, while the American Psychological Association will say, and they do say, we're making progress. We are making progress towards destigmatizing this conversation. There is still some bias that people have. I would view somebody differently if I knew they had a mental disorder, or people with mental health disorders scare me. That's the place where we need to make continued progress, and continue as leaders to create an environment where folks can show up and feel as though it's okay to talk about your emotions. It's okay to bring those emotions into the workplace. So last but not least, non-judgmental. This individual is not a lesser employee, and they are not a lesser person. How can you as a leader create the environment, we call it an environment of psychological safety, where people feel safe to express? They feel safe to be vulnerable and bring their whole self, including those feelings and emotions, into the workplace. Can you be mindful of your word choice? You know, that client is psycho, or I've heard, someone say that they're off the reservation, which is just bad word choice on so many different levels. They're crazy. And look, we have to constantly work at this and check ourselves, but finding ways to be mindful of the environment that you create, the word choice that you use, so that you can be supportive and send the message to your people that this is a place where you can increasingly feel safe to bring your whole self to the workplace, and approach those conversations thoughtfully. I want to recognize, and I am not going to bring this visual in at the end, though I thought about it. I wanted to rally this discussion with such a phenomenal example of prioritization of mental wellness, and that was Simone Biles. So I think we all know what she did at the Olympics to prioritize her own wellness and well-being and step away from her opportunity at a gold medal. But I stopped myself from putting it up there, and I stopped myself from getting too soapboxy about her, because I recognized my own bias. When that was first announced, my feeling was, gosh, she worked so hard, and maybe she's letting her team down. And, as somebody who myself can be focused on accomplishment, I thought, well, she's not going to be accomplishing that gold medal. So even, somebody who likes to think that I have an open mind and I want to embrace this topic, we have to constantly check our own biases and stop and say, well, what am I bringing into that assessment of her or of my people as a leader that I need to check, that I need to work on? And we know that working on your unconscious bias is an ongoing process. You never sort of reach nirvana, but being able to recognize our bias around issues of mental wellness and well-being, so that we can create a safe space, be non-judgmental. So sometimes as I'm doing these webinars, I feel like the front end of it is a little bit more about how leaders can show up in terms of their mindset, how they can think about the role of leader, how they can think about the way to be in a conversation with their employee. And I sometimes wonder if part of my audience is saying, okay, Leah, what are the actions? Can you just give me a couple of actions? And so I'll bat a little cleanup, as the metaphor goes, and give you some actions that you can take as a leader. First of all, build trust. I said it, in some prior slides. That will always serve you as a leader, whether you're looking to communicate in a more meaningful way, or delegate or hold people accountable or coach. It is a foundational element of your relationship at home and your relationships at work. Build trust with your people. That's the one thing you can do. Number two, what else can you do? Well, have you looked at expectations and appropriate deadlines? If your people are feeling that blurring of home and life, are you talking about that and acknowledging that maybe there is this always on feeling that they have with respect to work? Can you talk about that and maybe set more realistic expectations and deadlines. What do they need, right? That question about what do I need to know or how can I support you? There may be information that you get about the resources that you can provide or the adjustments that you can make to help them show up in a way that is more present and both, again, physically well and mentally well. I think this also is about understanding as a leader, what resources does your organization offer? Again, I'm intentionally not going into that in this session because I think that's covered in other topics and other articles. But many organizations have resources in place to help individuals both continue to maintain mental wellness, and they have resources when folks feel as though that mental wellness is compromised so that they can get support. Maybe you can modify hours and modify days in this hybrid and virtual environment. And as I said earlier, revisiting the impact of digital fatigue. We know that that has been playing a really big role in the burnout that people feel. And so revisiting that digital always on sensation that maybe people have is something that you can control as a leader. And then last but not least, I had to go back to this one, the prioritization of people over profits. So how can I make sure I am focusing on the person in front of me and not just the employee or the producer in front of me? It's about the person. And then last but not least, I did want to acknowledge that there are certainly many efforts that are underway at the organizational level. And I won't cover all of them, but there are a host of organizations. I'll provide some logos who are doing things like mental health days. I'm working with a client right now who is adding 4 mental health days to everyone's existing vacation days, recognizing that sometimes you just need that extra time to decompress or to deal with other things. There is another organization who has 4 mandatory mental health days. So 1 day a quarter where there are no meetings, everyone is, intended to on that same day. So no one's having meetings that day. Again, disconnect and give more time to their wellness and well-being. I mentioned extra vacation, the adjustment of hours, digital disconnect. There's also increased anxiety that some folks feel around working in a hybrid or virtual environment and the oversight that they feel by their leaders who are maybe micromanaging or watching over them. So some of this is also about, again, expressing that trust that you have in your people. I'm not watching over you. I believe that you will get the work done when you need to get it done in an autonomous way. And I trust that you're going to also use maybe some of a traditional workday to take care of your personal needs, to address issues of wellness and well-being. And then last but not least, there are also certainly a lot of organizations providing training. Meditation for Leadership is a partner that I've gotten connected with. They do incredible things in helping to bring the concept of meditation directly into the lives and the roles of leaders. And I think that whether it's Meditation for Leadership or Mequilibrium, there are several organizations that offer not just some of the access to resources that you see up here, but also training that can be done to support leaders as they continue to, again, open up this conversation more broadly, provide resources to their people, and themselves take advantage of what I think is, again, an increasingly important conversation. So here are some organizations that are leading the way. I have an article that I'll share in the references. You can read about what they're doing. Some of them are, I would say, launching campaigns is maybe the best way to describe it, focusing on, are you okay? Or, what's going on? Something like that. campaigns that invite people to have those conversations and invite discussions about mental wellness. They may be, again, providing access to training and development opportunities, whether that is on yoga or mindfulness or meditation, something that gives their people some additional tools that they can use to be centered and to take care of their well-being. I mentioned the additional days of access to vacation or mental health days, but this is not something that is confined to spas across the United States or across the world. This is not something that is only for a subset of the population. The concept of mental wellness has gone, I would say it's gone mainstream. And all you need to do is look at significant organizations like this to know that this is not something that's confined to sort of a niche conversation or small industries. It's gone big time, and I couldn't be happier because it's an important area for organizations and leaders to focus on. So here's a quote from Unilever. If you want a high performing company, you need resilient, healthy employees. So it is still absolutely, while I say people over profits, it does have an impact on the performance at your organization. Companies like Unilever, CEOs like this are recognizing that in order for our people to produce for us and perform for us, we need them to be healthy. And they need to be healthy, not just physically, but as it relates to mental wellness and well-being. So last but not least, aware, listen, learn, inquire, and non-judgmental. I hope you remember that and are able to maybe anchor to that from time to time as you consider how it is that you want to show up for the people that you lead and how you want to encourage the leaders in your organization to step into this conversation. As I said, to open up the discussion, to destigmatize the conversation around mental wellness, that they will increasingly shed light on why it's relevant and fundamentally be part of what I see as a positive attitude change towards again, leading a workforce from a holistic perspective. So what's coming up next? As I said, I have a bit of a funky mouse here, but what's coming up next is the third webinar in the recalibration series, which is about stability and agility in leadership. Certainly we know, as I've said on this webinar and the prior one, we're in volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous times. And yes, we want leaders to be agile, but I think maybe we have gone a little bit too far into the agile mindset, as much as I love it. And I'd like to suggest that we help leaders focus on both stability and agility in leadership, because that will serve them during continued times of uncertainty. So with that, I'd love to open it up for any questions, any discussions, anything that anyone would like to share or ask of me or of your colleagues on the call. All right, and I promised, as I wait to see if there are any questions, that I would share the resources, many of which I've referenced or I stumbled across as I was preparing for this webinar. So as you get access to the recording or the slides through leaderconnect.net, you will certainly also have the ability to access the links that I shared. And I hope that you will continue to promote this webinar, the recording, the one that's coming up in 2 weeks. And I thank you. Oh, so let's see, we do have a question here. So could I talk a little bit more about taking a pulse on your team? Hattie, thanks for that question. From your slide about being non-judgmental. Yeah, thank you for that. I did go over that quickly. So, when you are leading a team meeting, it's very natural to do a round robin and have people maybe give an update on the projects. We spend a lot of time in those meetings talking about contribution. I think increasingly it's appropriate to ask your team how they're doing and incorporate questions that get at their own mental wellness. And it might look something like, you can get creative with those questions, right? If you were, I love metaphors, so if you were if you had a metaphor to describe how you feel right now, what would it be, right? And you might hear something like burnt toast or a wrung out sponge, or maybe you might ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being, I'm cool as a cucumber, and 10 being, I'm particularly frazzled right now. Where is everyone? So find ways to begin to open up this discussion and recognize that that people may be dealing with additional stress and anxiety. And I think, again, you send that message in that team environment that this is a safe space for us to talk not just about what we're contributing to our organization, but also how we're feeling individually, and then get sort of a pulse on the overall mood of the team. It's not to suggest that wellness is a group analysis. It really is individualized. That being said, I do think that there's something to be said for creating a safe space where your team sees and hears that you are comfortable asking them about and having them reflect the emotions and the feelings that they have within the context of work. Thanks for the question, Hattie. Appreciate that. All right, well, we are at 12:57. I want to thank you for joining the webinar. I hope that you'll dial in to the session that we have in 2 weeks. Please go ahead and share the recording with colleagues and friends who you think might benefit. And with that, I wish you a happy and peaceful rest of your Wednesday, and thank you again for joining.